6 weeks ago, Alan, you guys were told in the UK that it was time to start living with COVID, and just like the flu, and that's happening to us right now. You know, we're just coming out of it, and we're just being told to let's get on with it. But that all got turned on its head, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. Basically, we saw a knee-jerk reaction, a precautionary principle, panic when you should be calm and reasonable. After Chris Whitty said we should live with this like the flu, Dr. Coetzee from South Africa told the world about Omicron, but she has been absolutely aghast at the UK's reaction in particular, who, rather than recognising that whilst it transmits very quickly, the sicknesses are far lower, they're mild symptoms and very few hospitalizations or deaths. And you could argue that's a good thing. It shows that immunity works and that the vaccines have worked to a certain extent. And even if you catch it and you've had a vaccine, or if you've had COVID before and you have higher immunity usually than you do with a vaccine, that fortunately severe illnesses and hospitalizations and deaths are low. And so that should be a triumph. Instead, the UK government decided to impose completely arbitrary impositions, like mask wearing in some places, so cloth masks in some places, which is a pantomime. The efficacy is very limited. There's no real evidence for the benefits. And vaccine passports, which again are a pantomime, because we know that in places where people are fully vaccinated and they have vaccine passports, France, for instance, you can't go to places without them. They have very high transmissions. So you're actually saying, let's do this something must be done thing, but actually you're not stopping transmissions. You're just pretending that you're doing something, but actually you're very damaging to the businesses, but also to civil liberties and the whole question of show me your papers. Now we've got a situation where, we've had a situation already where there was mandatory vaccinations imposed on care workers. And some people might think that's a good thing. They think, well, you know, if you work with care workers, you have a responsibility. But let's just keep remembering the transmissions point. You can have a vaccination and transmit. So if you're going to say to people who have worked right the way through the pandemic, when things were really serious and dangerous, who have not had a vaccination, now they either have a vaccination or they can't work there anymore. What you get is a situation that people who are nervous or hesitant or can't or won't, for whatever reason, which we should remind ourselves, the whole foundation of a free society is individual sovereignty, is control over our own bodies. The argument's pretty much been one that women should have a choice about what they do with their bodies. So too with everyone. If you argue that you have mandatory vaccinations, what ends up happening is 40,000 people in Britain now no longer work in care homes. Care homes have been so badly damaged throughout lockdowns, the treatment of our most loved ones, the great generation. And this just adds insult to injury. And now we've had the announcement and the vote, which the vote, by the way, was ushered in. It was meant to be in January, but they ushered it in a package of 5 different things, of which vaccine passports and mask wearing was part of them, to have mandatory vaccinations for NHS workers. 100,000 of them have not had the vaccination. We're now saying that if they don't have it, and April is the date it starts, but they have to start taking them by February the 3rd. So February the 3rd is the date, actually. Now, when you say mandatory vaccinations, that 100,000 people, you haven't won hearts and minds. You haven't convinced them. I'm all for that. I think we should have an open debate about the risks and the rewards of all things and the benefits. And it can definitely be argued, I think, that for highly vulnerable people and elderly, that it can stop them with hospitalizations and deaths. However, firstly, for younger people, that's absolutely not the case. And secondly, transmissions. We know that whether it's 2 or 3, you can transmit. Pfizer's original study never claimed to stop transmissions. What they claimed was that it would stop serious illnesses and deaths. So what is the argument? What is the virtue in doing mandatory vaccines just from a health point of view? Well, it's not. We're under enormous pressure, as we are every winter at the NHS. Every winter for the last 15 years, the NHS has been in crisis. We've now lost 6,000 beds because of, on the one hand, spacing beds for some COVID response, and also because of cuts. And now we're going to lose 100,000 workers, staff workers, who remember have worked right through the pandemic and put themselves on the line, because the government does not feel capable of winning hearts and minds. The head of the Royal College of Nursing said a long time ago, you need to be able to convince people, right? You need to sit down and have conversations with them. We saw the Labour frontbencher resign at the vote, because she said quite rightly, you need to have a discussion with people and convince them of the merits of this. And so this idea that the state now tells us that in order to be able to work, you have to take a procedure, and if you don't, you won't work, is a very, very concerning, worrying moment. In New York, they started off with municipal workers like they did in Chicago and some other places, and many people, first responders, fire, police, ambulance and municipal workers, who all had been at the front line for the whole time. And if we remember back in when they started, people were clapping for the NHS. Now we've got a situation where the people they were clapping for are now being told they're going to be fired if they don't take something that's mandatory. Absolutely unacceptable. But in New York, what they've done, they've gone a step further, like they have done in Austria and elsewhere, and they're doing in Germany, which is mandatory vaccinations. And now what's going to happen in New York is that you have to, in a private business, they will be fined if their employees do not have a mandatory vaccination.
So basically, I mean, I've been reading about this as well, but in Austria, it's now illegal not to be vaccinated.
Yes, and you get fined, and it can be several thousand euros. Also in Greece, anyone over 60 can be fined. You have a whole situation where you basically criminalizing a whole section of society, very dangerous, where you start pointing fingers at people and saying, you are the ones who are to blame. We know historically that never ends well, wherever it is. We know in America, they have a history of mandatory vaccinations that have also been very problematic, and why there is hesitancy amongst certain groups, certain demographics in cities particularly, that are nervous about it. In a free society, you should never have mandatory impositions of health issues. People need to make choices about what they do with their body. Now, people say, well, you can make that choice, but you shouldn't work there. Well, here's the thing. Either we're serious about having an NHS that can be equipped to save people, and also we need to talk about immunity that's come as a result of people having had COVID. That conversation's gone away. Where are all the antibody tests that were discussed? Where are all the discussions about T-cell and antibody immunity, which studies from Israel have shown over, you're 25 times more immune than you are if you've had the vaccination. It seems like people have got completely obsessed with one solution only. And then rather than having the troubling issue of having to convince people, they've imposed it. It's utterly wrong. We've got a big campaign. Togetherdeclaration.org has now 165,000 signatories. We have a new campaign starting next week that's going to run for a month, challenging the idea of mandatory vaccinations. We just did a campaign where before the vote that went through Parliament, we got all of our members to go to constituencies to lobby their MPs to tell them they would vote on the basis of how they voted on this. And we are encouraging people to take action locally, regionally, and nationally. If you're vaccinated, you're meant to be protected. What someone else does is not anyone's concern. You say, well, I don't want to sit next to someone, or I don't want to be in a hospital setting. Well, you might argue that, but the point is that there's transmissions, and people say, well, the vaccine does increase the likelihood you won't get it transmitted. There's very little evidence that's been presented to that. When you really boil down on the granular data, that's not the case, because people haven't done that research, because you have to basically do a number of calculations, qualitative calculations. So they haven't done that. They assert it. But now we know that people who've had 3 jabs are transmitting and have got COVID. And yet whilst we know, and this is the problem, right? What we were being told a little while ago was, have the vaccinations, right? You had 2 jabs, right? We've got this terrible danger of Omicron, which it was not that. It was mild symptoms, as Dr. Coatsy and others said. So get your booster. Okay, well, you're saying that the vaccines don't work for it, so why get the booster? Now people have had the booster, and people are still getting transmissions, because transmissions and these so-called cases, and this is the other thing that needs to be said, mass testing is not helpful. Mass testing of healthy people. One, people get pinged on an app. We have an NHS app, so they stop working in the NHS, they stop working, they stop having to go to school. Again, people are restricted and isolating. Two, these so-called cases are not people that are very sick, are hospitalized or dying. So you have this whole narrative and a way of contextualizing things that is very one-sided. Now, my mum, for instance, 2 weeks ago, a lot of her friends this year have died of cancer. And we went to a funeral, everyone wore masks and there was no singing. I can't tell you how sad that is and why people should be doing that. But now my mum does not want to come to Christmas dinner with the family. She's had 3 vaccinations. The whole family's been vaccinated. And it's all of her friends that are still alive. They're not talking about all the cancer deaths. They're not talking about the millions of people waiting on the NHS for treatment, stroke, heart disease, all the other things. Not talking about the GPs are not seeing people now because they're making way for the COVID response, boosting 20, 30-year-olds. They're not talking about the NHS that can't see people because of COVID-only responses. What they're talking about is they're nervous about seeing their loved ones. This is utterly damaging the way this has been presented and discussed, and it's a height of irresponsibility. And we need a calm, rational, open debate that does not just have a series of fear-mongering and hyper-inflated modelling that keeps being proven to be wrong. We should never have locked down the whole of society. And the Great Barrington Declaration made that point about shielding. And what we've ended up doing is creating a load of collateral damages in terms of the economy, other health issues. We've had 50,000 undiagnosed cancer patients just recently, 750,000 in total. We've got a massive crisis of all sorts of health issues, and no one's talking about them. They're being obsessed with boosting 20, 30-year-olds. And now, even though the Joint Committee of Vaccine and Immunisation, the JCVI, said on reflection, the risk versus the rewards, don't vaccinate children. We now have young children being told they should be vaccinated. Now, interestingly, lots of parents have been vaccinated. We have about an 85% vaccination, 90% rate in Britain, right? Very high, but they're not the same for their children. And because people understand, because the concerns for the impacts, and this is the other thing, we have not been able to have honest, open discussions. You could be very pro-vaccine and also recognize that for young children, it's not the thing to do. And we need to discuss that there are side effects. And you do this generally with any pharmacology or anything, right? You say, right, you take these things, but these are all the things that could happen, and people make choices. You don't pull them down from social media and have Ofcom stop them challenging the narrative. Ofcom is the body that regulates what can be broadcast in the UK. So you have this one-sided debate where anyone who raises up any questions about impacts gets presented as an anti-vaxxer. It's very lazy, it's very dangerous, and it's very wrong.
The bit I don't understand about kids is that that it's very mild for them when it happens, the disease. And regardless of that, once they've had it, because they don't die of it, they've got natural immunity, which I think the Israel study has proven is far more effective to prevent hospitalization than the vaccine.
It's with a heavy heart I've watched what's happened in Australia. I mean, particularly Victoria, right? Particularly Victoria, but generally, I mean, I just think that it's been absolutely astonishing and unconscionable the way that citizens have been treated. They've been beaten up, shot at in the name of health. And Australia, I lived in for quite some time, and I have a love relationship. It's the first place I ever fell in love with. I did loads of events. I'm a lover of Australia. And it's been like watching your first love be desecrated in the name of health that actually is not actually true. And I just would really encourage everyone, I know you're speaking to a business fraternity, business sector is really important and can have a voice in lobbying, but also the people who come to those events, the public, because in the end, it's the public that changes things. It's when people, it's historically, whether it's the women's vote or civil rights or anything, it's when the public gets involved. And that's what we're doing with the Together Declaration.org.
So with your members, I mean, or the people that make up your members in the sort of hospitality sector or the nighttime industries sector, I mean, just from a practical point of view, if you want to separate that bit of the argument out, Alan, their employees have to get vaccinated. They've got to do part of the policing to make sure that the public that are coming in are vaccinated. They're going to lose 10 to 15% of their custom anyway, which is probably represents all of their profit, because you've got those people that either aren't vaccinated or are bloody minded and will not show their papers to get in. I get there's this kind of thing where I think people in events and hospitality suffering from a sort of Stockholm syndrome, where they're grateful to their abuser to let them out, and they're agreeing to the very restrictions that are sort of poisoning their business. I mean, where do those businesses stand at the moment? Because Christmas
at the moment, it's not mandatory for the hospitality workers here in the UK to get a vaccine. It is the case that in New York it is, right, at the moment. But all the other things are absolutely correct. And the thing is that I had a big discussion initially, because I always like to discuss with people. Some of the 50 representatives from the live sector advocated for test to enter. Tests to enter are a parody. You take a test at home, you get on a bus or a train. What does that mean, right? It's a complete joke, right? Because you can get that. If you follow the logic, well, then you come into contact with the public after you've taken the test. Unless you have a secure unit at the events, which no one can afford to do, where you test and then go in subsequently. And even then with tests, we know there's all sorts of issues with them, as we've seen. And I made the case to them that you should put in clause test to enter, that's going to be linked to vaccine passports, it's all going to be connected. Sure enough, the government made the argument, oh, we've got these different people in the live sector that are doing this. They made a rod for their own back. And the point is that people have become very scared about being seen as irresponsible. Because at the start, I said, well, you only want to do this because you're making money from it, as though, firstly, making money is a dirty thing. How does anyone think the NHS is paid for? It's from people making money, doing business, paying taxes. But let's have it straight that if you don't have a dynamic economy, we can't pay for all these things. But secondly, and more importantly, everyone who's in hospitality are very responsible. We're parts of local communities. We think very carefully about things. But even those who wanted to challenge it, who own business companies, some of their staff got so shaken that they started saying, well, even if the owner said, we're not going to do this, whether it's vaccine passports or whatever, then the staff and the licensees now will say, well, we think we've got to do it. So you've got this tension, right, where this imposition is being imposed on licensed events and premises. That's the most regulated sector going. Since the Defence of the Realm Act, the licensing industry has always been that, because it's about ordinary people. So unlike private members or people in 10 Downing Street, they're not subject to the same kind of restrictions. But public health and the police can come at any time, and they know they can control them. So, but I do think that, so many people spoke out bravely with us with Open for All, but we know that, and I knew this all along, that when it comes to the point, if they make it a law, you either close or you open with it. There's no alternative, right? Because if you start opening and saying you're not going to do it, like Swansea Cinema did, very quickly you get closed down and you can be in prison. Now, we raised some money for Swansea Cinema in Wales, in Swansea. Cinema said, we're not going to do it. Wales had passed vaccine passports. People went down there. We raised 60,000. They're fighting a court case. But that's the reality of the situation. And I do think that people need to be clear that there's absolutely no scientific or health basis for this. Even if there was, there'd be a very strong political argument that we should not have show me your papers. But as it happens, there is no evidence. There's no attempt to present evidence in Parliament or to the public, because all the evidence points to very damaging impacts on business, up to 60% in Manhattan in some places, 30% in Scotland and Wales. Footfall reduces, a range of issues. All the Christmas cancellations have cost hundreds of millions. Some people say billions, right? About hundreds of millions. So one of the busiest times of the year, all cancellations now as a consequence of this fearful panic. And I think that, businesses need to speak up, industry needs to speak, and recognize that you create a rod for your own back. You start arguing these things, it will be used and imposed on you. It's very wrong. I personally don't go into places in New York. You could work out from what I'm saying that even though I could go into them because I've made a choice that would enable me to do it, it's a very different choice than showing papers to do something. Absolutely.
I mean, you're representing their customer, aren't you?
Yeah.
And there's going to be quite a few people like you, or us, if you like. The other thing, Alan, is when does this all stop?
You're going to ask me you're saving all the difficult questions till the end. I think it stops when we say it stops. Otherwise, we run the risk that every time there's a variant, every time there's an issue, every time there's an NHS resource, every time there's a problem, the default position is, well, let's all wear masks, let's all have a little lockdown, let's have a restriction. You're like, what are you talking about? No. But people have to stand up, and it's one thing to say things on social media. We need to get together, we need to get organised locally, regionally, have our voices heard, and make sure that we amplify that so that elected representatives know that their ballot position is on the line, and the government knows that. The government, we should remind ourselves, in Britain, only won this vote because Keir and Boris have a coalition now, right? But they had 126 people vote against, 100 Tory MPs vote against it. He's in an almost constitutional crisis. In the new year, we're going to see what this means for his leadership and everything. The biggest ever revolt was around the Iraq War. The second biggest was around Brexit, and we know what happened with those things, and how people look back on them. So in a similar way, we've got that situation. So even though they won that particular battle, in this war that's going on about how to respond to things, and if you still uphold freedom and liberty and rights and all the things that we stand on the shoulders of the brave people who fought for them not so long ago, our grandparents, right? Those that would scupper them, we have a responsibility. We're custodians of those things. So
do you reckon that Boris is the UK Prime Minister is out of a job then because of this?
I don't know. You need 54 people to go to the 1922 committee to put a ballot of no confidence. I don't know. I mean, one of the things is, I'm not sure who would replace him that would be any better, quite frankly. And certainly Labour would be much worse, because they're arguing for more impositions, more lockdowns. But we'll see. The point is, we're not where we were 20 months ago. And lots of people in the media and elsewhere are speaking very differently to us now. But again, the public has to have their voices heard.
Well, we've got an election coming up in March or May, and obviously it's a federal system over here compared to the UK. But yeah. I mean, I know you've been advocating very strongly for people to politely, which I think is a very bit of a stretch for some people to do, bearing in mind what they've been putting up with for the past almost 2 years, write to their MPs and let them know what they think. I mean, you're suggesting that that's what people should do over here.
I'm saying that we do a number of things. So the thing about being civil and polite doesn't mean that you're a walkover. You be firm as well. But you see, too many times, like if there's a protest, there might be 10 people at the end of it that have a scrummage with the police in London. And then that's what my mum watches on TV. Rather than you've had hundreds of thousands of people out, ordinary people challenging things in a peaceful, calm way. So we say politely and civilly, because I think that's the way to conduct ourselves, right? I think that if you've got the right arguments, you can convince people, but you start, and that. So that's that. But we email, write actual letters, deliver them the letters, go have a meeting with them, phone them up, leave messages on their answer phones, and let them know that they're going to be held accountable at the ballot box, and that lots of people, once they start hearing from more than about 10 constituents, they start getting very nervous, because they know that, particularly marginal seats. And that's what I'd encourage everyone to do as one of the things. I'd also encourage people to write articles, to post things on social media, and to organise locally and nationally. Obviously, Australia's enormous, right? And you've got different states and you've got different regions, but, just unite and discuss and carry on making those points, because there's going to be a reckoning for all this. I mean, who knows where it's going to go? It's like anything in history, it depends what we do. But you can't keep doing the same thing well, you could do, but you have a different kind of society then, right? Then you have an autocratic, authoritarian society. People have to choose if they want to live in that or not.
I mean, if you look at what's happening in New Zealand, it's incredibly authoritarian. And but Jacinda Ardern, up until a few weeks ago, was smiling and tell everybody to stay safe and be kind, Alan. And it kind of it ran it to its expiry date. Okay, so I mean that basically what you're saying to people is act as individuals.
Individuals and get together in local groups of people who are like-minded, form a little alliances, stand outside the shopping centre, talk to people, get involved. We're going to be sharing our assets with people around the world, with friends in different countries. We know people in Canada, Australia, obviously, United States, Brazil, elsewhere, where people can share some of these things and we can all do similar stuff. But yeah, I'd really encourage that.
And what's going to happen if we don't?
Well, one thing you can be guaranteed of is that if you don't do something, if you don't try and curate something, if you don't try and paint your own picture, if you don't go out and do something, you can be guaranteed that your input won't be there. So that's what we can guarantee. So if you want to see things a certain way, then the responsibility is on you. It's all very well people pointing fingers saying it's all a plan or nothing can work. That's fatalism. It also treats the public with contempt in the same way the government does. It says they're not capable of being changed. They're not susceptible to ideas. My arguments aren't strong enough. We need to sack all that, take it upon ourselves. What am I going to do? What is my role in this in trying to affect the change that I'd like to see? Take ourselves seriously, make the change happen together. Listen, history is littered with losses. But when we lose, if we do lose something, we carve out a space that people look to about the argument for freedom. And if that goes, we're done. This experiment that we're doing of liberal freedom, right, is a short and small one. There are many places, if we have this conversation, I'll end up being taken away and so will you, right? Those big nations where some of that things are happening are very influential currently. Are we going to hold a light up for freedom and our way of life or not? That's the only question people need to ask themselves.